All right, welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. And of course, inside the courtroom in Idaho today, we heard some emotional victim statements following the brutal death of those 4 University of Idaho students. They called him a coward, pathetic, and also even the judge saying the worst of the worst for Bryan Kohberger, as he now will serve 4 life sentences there in those killings. I do want to put up just some of these sounds real quickly here on Live Now from Fox from what we heard inside of the courtroom during sentencing today.
He is a hollow vessel, something less than human, a body without empathy, without remorse. He chose destruction. He chose evil. He feels nothing. He tried to take everything from me. My friends, my safety, my identity, my future. He took their lives, but I will continue trying to be like them, to make them proud.
All right, just some emotional testimony there from friends and families of those 4 individuals. And we're going to be joined right now here by legal analyst Jacqueline Goodman. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. The judge says this was a close that ends the 15 minutes of fame for Bryan Kohberger. What was your big takeaway from sentencing today?
Thank you for having me. There were a lot of big takeaways. I mean, one of the things that I thought the survivors did so well was to both humanize the victims that were lost that tragic day in 2022, but also to talk about the impact that this had on their own lives. And so we saw that in graphic detail. It was harrowing. It was really heartrending to hear and to see really physically the emotion that came out of these family members as they talked about the effect that it had on them. But I thought what was most telling, or for me at least it was most telling, was when you heard less of the justifiable anger, but when you heard some of the statements that really went to a healing. I thought that those statements were just so remarkable because they said so much about the people that were giving their statements and who had loved these people that were lost. And I thought that was that kind of healing going forward and how they were committed to that, how they were doing that as an honor of their loved ones was truly remarkable.
Yeah, even one person said they had forgiven Bryan Kohberger for them, saying they didn't have hate in their heart. That was the minority of some of those victim statements, as people were notably angry during that, and rightly so. I do want to talk more because earlier in the week we talked about what we might learn during this case in terms of information from some of these victim statements, and we are learning that they will release some of the records from the police in Moscow, Idaho, of their investigation, their search for Bryan Kohberger, as they will release the documents in relation to that. What could we learn in terms of that from police and what they saw, what they heard from Kohberger himself during the investigation?
Sadly, I think what we're going to get out of that investigation are some of the more salacious details. I understand that some of the families really don't want this information out for public consumption because they feel like, to what end at this point. What I think they wanted, and I don't think is going to be released in these documents, is some semblance of a motive or how it is that Bryan Kohberger was in connection with these 4. There seems to be no evidence whatsoever that they had ever come in contact, that he had ever come in contact with any of the 4 of these students, and he had no connection to this, to the school, to the sororities, any of the organizations to which these students were involved. And so I think, that is probably not going to be revealed in these documents. Also, the why, not just the motive, but literally the why is not going to be released in these documents. I think the answer, at least it seems to me, is a mental illness issue. And I think that, the idea of this sort of cold-blooded murder is not going to be any more revealed than is already revealed by the results.
Yeah, that is a good point. They said
there's going to be some details that are going to come out, but I don't think it's going to be the motive that we're looking for.
Correct. Yeah, no way that they would find satisfactory. And like you mentioned, they don't know exactly who the target of this crime was. They said there really wasn't any connection. There was no indication that Bryan Kohberger followed them on social media or whatnot. We did hear during some of the victim statements talking about some of what they did to the friends and family there of these individuals that were making these statements. Was there anything in terms of that? Because they revealed some details, but these individuals that were in the victim statements weren't under oath, so they potentially could stretch the truth a little bit, correct?
Well, the statements are not evidence, so they're not checked, they're not under oath, they're not things that are subject to cross-examination. But we take them at face value. We take them for what their real meaning is, and it's less about the strict truth of those facts and more about the impact that this has had on their lives, and as they go forward, what they want everyone to know about their family members and their loved ones that were killed on that day. And so we don't really require them to take an oath and testify in a way that is strictly truthful. A lot of it is their own understanding of the facts surrounding this case and about their family members and about themselves.
I also wanted to bring up some of the comments from the judge as they called Bryan Kohberger the worst of the worst. And there was obviously some emotion in his voice as he was laying down some in the sentencing. What do we make of that? Is that common for a judge to do that? And obviously there is no appeal, but if there were, could that complicate things?
You know me, Eddie. I don't believe in the worst of the worst ideas. I believe in the frailty of human beings, but I do think that from time to time we see all of these tragic things sort of on full display in these criminal cases, and it's not unusual. I mean, one of the things I found was so unusual in this sentencing was that it looked as if the judge himself was crying. I've never seen that before in 31 years. And so judges are human beings like everybody else, and they can say things sometimes that might seem harsh, and it's understandable. Is it preferred? No, but it's understandable. And I think that's not going to have any effect. And quite frankly, there's cases in Idaho that really call into question whether it's possible legally to waive your right to appeal. And so you can sort of appeal that issue. There may be an appeal, but I don't think that those statements would ever affect the merits of the appeal, even if there were an appeal. Yeah, and that was part of that plea agreement, taking the guilty plea there. I do want to ask you about what was said, or maybe what was not said by Bryan Kohberger. As he was asked to respond, he said, quote, "I respectfully decline." Was that potentially under the advisement of his counsel? Do we expect to hear from Kohberger? I don't think we did, but what do we make of just those three small words? Probably. I would say probably it's under advice of counsel, but ultimately his right to allocution means that he has the ability, if he wants to make the ultimate decision about whether he's going to address the court, address the survivors in this case. He personally decided not to. It may have been with the advice of counsel in mind, but he was the one that ultimately made that decision. And it's what I expected, but I understand that that's something that was very, I think, hard for some of the victims' families to hear. And my last question before I let you go, because the judge also said that this will end the 15 minutes of fame for Bryan Kohberger. I've asked you this before, but is this the end of this book? It's the end of the book being in the spotlight the way it is. It probably is not the end. I think I would anticipate that there would be down the road at some point, maybe sooner rather than later, appeals, efforts to overturn the conviction, efforts to ameliorate the damage, so to speak, to Bryan Kohberger. He's going to be held in a place that is notoriously, there's a lot of solitary confinement that goes on in that Idaho maximum security prison. It's a rather notoriously harsh prison, and that's saying a lot because prisons are very, very harsh places. So I imagine that there will be post-conviction work on his case. Whether it'll be this closely watched, I doubt. All right, very good. Jacqueline, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. This is maybe not the end of the story, but a chapter closing for some of these families following this brutal murders there in Idaho. Thanks again for joining us. Good to see you.